The Lord be with you. As is our practice, I invite you to pray the prayer with me. I've tried to print it differently so it'll be easier to follow here. Gracious God, the source of all peace and calm, when the storms of life rage around us and our hearts are troubled, draw us near to your presence. Grant us the grace to turn to you with fears and to trust in your abiding love and care for all creation. Give us the strength to hold fast to hope, the wisdom to seek stillness in the chaos, and the courage to walk with faith, even in uncertainty. May your Holy Spirit guide our hearts to the peace that passes all understanding, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. All right, well, we are back to Fully Alive, which is Elizabeth Oldfield's most recent book, in which she talks about how we are to navigate turbulent times, how we are to tend to our souls during turbulent times. So that's our fundamental question that we're trying to ask. How do we tend to the soul during turbulent times? We're not trying to figure out who you ought to vote for. We're not trying to figure out whether the polls are right or wrong. We're trying to be attentive and aware of the environment we're in, and in the most faithful way, be present to it and to others in it. Now, Elizabeth Oldfield, who was formerly the executive director of a think tank called Theos, Theos, and she's done a lot of work in this area, but how many have read or are reading the book? I do want to recommend it to you, those of you who've been in the class and tried to read books I recommended before. I know. This one's better. It's easier, it's more accessible, and she says once she started writing it, she just couldn't help telling her personal story. So it's not a memoir, it's not really in that genre, but it is very grounded in her life, and I think that makes it very helpful and accessible. So she defines Fully Alive as living a life rich in gratitude, humility, connection, and community. You remember Fully Alive comes from the quote from the 4th century Bishop Irenaeus, the glory of God is a human being fully alive. And we spent some time last time we gathered exploring, what does that mean to you? When are you most fully alive? But you can see where Oldfield is going. Elizabeth is grounding the concept of fully aliveness in relationship, fundamentally in relationship, which is the only reason we're reading her book. And she's looking at the source of that relationship as gratitude, which is, I've maintained is the source of all of our spiritual life and faith, fundamentally is gratitude. So I think what she is saying and the place she is coming from is consistent with the kinds of discussions we've had here. And then she wants to look at sin. Not exactly what you'd want to go to class to talk about, sin. But she defines sin differently than maybe you've experienced it before. Again, remember, if fully alive is real relationship, then sin is simply everything working against connection. Everything working against connection. So if you just for a moment step back and think about your own life, sin wouldn't be a moral failing necessarily, or the breach of some rule. It is instead anything that gets in the way of relationship. Anything that gets in the way of relationship. Now she goes for her source text, the early statement by Evagrius in the Eastern Church of the 8 difficulties, which over time have become the 7 deadly sins, you'll remember. And then she goes through each one. But she doesn't spend a lot of time defining the sin, which I never find particularly helpful. Right? The more I find personally, the more I know about sin, the better sinner I become. So I've decided to focus not so much on sin, but instead on if that's the problem, what's the solution? Where are we going? How do we look forward? How do we say that's fine, but today we're looking toward tomorrow? And Elizabeth does that. She starts, for example, in the sin we're going to cover today. This is Avagoras and his bad thoughts, and Oldfield's 7 sins. She starts with wrath. Now, but she doesn't just spend a lot of time talking about anger. There are treatises on anger we could read. But instead, she says it's really a movement. It's really a movement from polarization, which you can imagine as division, separation, distinction, all those things that are sinful, the way she's defined sin, but move towards peacemaking, which is really the same movement Jesus is making in the gospel this morning, isn't it? Whoever isn't against us is for us, Jesus says to the disciples. Moving from the polarization, they're complaining about this healer who, while successful, nevertheless didn't follow them, and they think he ought not to be allowed to do all that. And Jesus kind of says, calm down, let's focus on what is happening here. And if he's truly connecting with the power of God, then he's with us, right? That's really what Jesus is saying. And then he says, be peacemakers at the end. Be peacemakers. Now, peace is not the absence of conflict, right? Peace is not the absence of conflict. Peace is living together in a productive, healthy way. It may actually contain conflict or division or disruption that wouldn't be, in my view, inconsistent with peace, or shalom, as it's called. It is instead living together in a healthy relationship. I don't even know of any healthy relationships that don't have some conflict in them. I'm not even sure it's possible, actually. I may get some help from those smarter than me, but it seems to me that we often grow through conflict. So if you didn't have any conflict, I wonder if you would grow. Do you remember there was an experiment some time back when somebody built a big geodesic dome out in the desert, I guess, that shielded everything from the weather? Do you guys remember this? And they built these trees inside of the dome, and the trees grew up, and they got to be really tall really fast, but they were brittle. They were brittle, and they wound up literally coming down. And what they learned was wood needs conflict, tension, the wind, to be strong. If it's not fighting against the wind while it's growing up, it's not going to be able to support its own weight when it does. Not a bad analogy, I think, for the role the conflict can play in our own spiritual development, in our own relationships. We grow. Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese monk who spends a lot of time on peacemaking, says somewhat famously, I hope there's suffering in heaven. Not a plea I hear many people making. Why? Because I only gain wisdom through suffering. So if there is no suffering, I would not gain more wisdom, and who would want to live that way? Do you see that logic? Obviously not suffering that breaks you, but suffering that lets you grow, suffering that makes you stronger, suffering that gives you wisdom. That's what we're talking about when we talk about peacemaking. All the threads are somehow woven together in a tapestry that is life, but not without conflict. So let's look at wrath. Paul says in Ephesians, be angry, but don't sin, which suits our purposes very well here. Be angry, but don't sin, suggesting that anger and sin aren't the same thing. It's not just bad to be angry, don't be angry. Nothing is less healthy than sitting on your anger, right? But there are ways that you can be angry that are helpful, right? And this is, again, a theme that Oldfield articulates over and over again. How do you bring things together, integrate them in some kind of whole? So we're not moving from side to side, pretending the other side doesn't exist. Our negative emotions would be an example of that. How do we integrate them into a healthy life? So wrath, then, is simply sin. Wrath is the anger that separates us from each other. Now, to make that point, she points to a church policy in the Pentecostal tradition. We should adopt this here, I think. In the Pentecostal tradition, so Oldfield says, the rule is when you're angry at someone, tell them. That's not hard. Here's the interesting caveat. But hold their hand while you do it. Hold their hand while you do it. Because if you're physically touching, then you're protecting against separation, right? You're maintaining relationship through your bodily face-to-face connection. I think that's an interesting thing, right? For example, think about the last time you got an outrageous text or email from somebody that just seemed to be angry and adolescent and loud. There was a day for those old folks when people typed in all caps. Do they still do that? I don't know. Anyway, the point is, often they would never say that to you if you were face to face, right? That's why I don't even look at comment sections on any kind of controversial post on any social media, because they're just nuts. This is even true for Carolina basketball. That's how bad it's gotten. It's just nuts. And it's not helpful either. You don't learn anything. But I personally have a practice of keying in an email. This is a dangerous practice, but it works for me. Of keying in an email and then deleting it or letting it sit there for a minute. Like I'm usually triggered and I'm responding, and it's not totally inappropriate. I've grown beyond that in the past week. But it's raw, right? It's raw, and it's not how I want them to feel when they receive that email. That's not the emotional tone is not the message I want to communicate. So you can modify the email, you can send it on. I will tell you that I worked for a guy years ago who did that with a really angry letter. He threw it in a drawer, and the secretary found it and mailed it. So it's not a perfect practice. But I like this idea to demonstrate the point that if you're connected, you can get away with all kinds of stuff, particularly inside your more intimate relationships, right? At least with me, if you have some sense that the relationship is not at risk, then you can take a lot. If what you read from the anger or the scolding, that the relationship's at risk, that's pretty hard to deal with, right? And that's where contempt comes in, which of course is a relationship killer. So we kind of usually know this as adults, but not always. But it's particularly true with kids, right? What do your children hear when they're being disciplined? Again, showing my age, do you guys know who Bill Cartwright is? He was a center who played for the Chicago Bulls, and he was, 8.5 feet tall. And he did this commercial where the camera was down on the floor looking up at him. So you're sitting on your couch, and it's like, and he said simply, this is what your kids see when you scold them. This is what your kids see when you scold them. I didn't raise my voice to my kids for 1.5 years. I mean, it was frightening. But we are communicating an emotional message every time we're communicating at all. So that's wrath. What is peacemaking? So there was it's not a World Cup match, but it was a big match, I've forgotten when it was exactly, between England and the Dutch. This is the Dutch team. That's the famous Dutch coach standing up there in the middle. They were the best in Europe. England were a bunch of ragamuffins, and nobody expected them to do very well. But there was just so much pressure on the English team from the press that before the match, the English team literally got on a plane and went to Asia to get away from it, just to be together, do something fun. But it turned out they had a little too much fun. So suddenly pictures began appearing of all the English players drunk at bars and running around with people they shouldn't be running around to. And they apparently trashed the plane on the way back, and all of that got to be a thing. So the English were not very happy at the behavior of their team. And here were the Dutch. They thought it would be just an awful game. Somebody would run away with it, and they were right. The English ran away with it. Somehow, the English played so well together as a team that they wind up winning the match by multiple goals. I've forgotten the score kind of to the delight of everybody in England and the horror of the Dutch. And when asked what happened, the coach pointed to this picture. You look at this picture, here are the Dutch guys. See these guys in the back table? They're from Sudan. They are world-class athletes, but they are not part of the inner circle. They don't get to stay in the same hotel. They don't travel in the same vehicles. The way the substitution patterning was done led them to believe that they were being excluded, and they felt resentful, as we all would. And I'm not saying they tanked the match, I'm just saying perhaps they weren't fully in it. The Dutch team didn't play together. They didn't play as a team, and it cost them this very important match. By the way, all the destruction on the plane, one guy on the English team did it all. One guy kind of went berserk. Who paid for it? The whole team. They refused to reveal who it was. They all shared in the cost. What do we learn from that about peacemaking? Some of it is creating an opportunity for everybody to be part of what's going on, right? Some of it is about striving to respect the dignity of every human being. Teams that are able to do this play well above their capabilities. The sum is truly greater than its parts. Teams that don't, and this happens all the time, are left with superstars but never win the championship. Left with superstars but never win the league. Wondering why. Because it's not about the system, is it? It's about the people. It's about the people. Now this also translates into any other structure, I think. In business, we call it discretionary effort, right? If you don't create an environment where your employees want to provide discretionary effort, then when 5 o'clock comes, they don't hit the rest of the nail and go home. That's a metaphor for a white service job, but you know what I'm talking about? When I worked construction, let me tell you, at 5 o'clock, we quit. I don't care what was going on. It could be raining that night and on the roof was half shingled. It was 5, we were going home. That's the absence of discretionary effort there. But in sports, it's easy to see, and teams that are able to do that, I think, are able to succeed. There's also a wonderful story about Apple and Sony. I'm going back a ways, and I'm going to be a little sketchy on the facts, but you remember the Sony Walkman was the thing, right? You don't have to admit you had a Walkman, but I know who you are. That was the thing. And Steve Jobs understood that portable devices that played music were going to be a big deal. And so they're looking at the iPod and they're looking at the iPhone. Now, at Sony, they had a new CEO who'd been at Nestle, and he was trying to drive efficiency. So he took all the people in all the various units and he broke them off into separate business units so they didn't talk to each other. So the people that are doing the mechanical design and the people that are doing the connectivity and the people that are doing the music content were in different parts of the company not talking to each other. Steve Jobs, on the other hand, every year had what he called the gathering of the 100. So he took the 100 people that in the company that he didn't want to be without if he started a new company. This is a little harsh, I admit, but it makes the point. And he takes them off to a luxurious retreat, and they all decide, beginning with the 10 highest priorities, which 3 they're going to pursue and which one's going to have the high priority. Because they're all doing it together. So they're all talking to each other. They're all involved in the design and the strategy and the implementation. So then Sony has its product, and they get around to figuring out that, the key to this whole thing is not the technological sophistication of the product itself, but the music. Do you have the content? So the guys in Sony who had built the product and gotten the connectivity went running over to the music guys and said, give us that music category. We got some of the best music around. And they said, oh, sorry, we've already licensed it to Steve Jobs. Who won the war? Do you have a Sony Walkman or do you have an iPhone? Right? I think it's fair to say that Steve Jobs' ability to get everybody involved talking to each other with collective responsibility for what was going on wasn't important in that structure. So again, moving to the next point, Elizabeth talks about people not like me. People not like me. This is what I preached about at 8:45, so I know you're well versed in the concept already. She actually took it from a guy named John Yates, who wrote a book called Fractured, which goes into this at a little bit better depth. But the whole concept is simply that we seek out people that are like us. That's where we feel comfortable. And thanks to the demographic sorting of this country, thanks to all the other things that are kind of leaving us separated from each other, people are increasingly in bubbles with only people like them, right? And that the cost of that is any kind of common life. The habits, rituals, and institutions that used to bring those people together have been eroded. As a result, people don't know each other. When you get your social media feed, whoever your not like me group is, ultimately you get this algorithmically pushed information that doesn't show you anything about people not like you except things going to make you angry, right? And since you don't really know any of those people anyway, you don't know how to test the validity and accuracy of what you hear. Does that make sense? So you get trapped. It's not because we're bad people. We just get trapped in this system. So to try to dramatize this, though, I want to ask you a question. You can share with us if you want to, but I do want you to answer it for yourself first. Can you think of a time when you were comfortable at a party? It was fun. I went to the Peachtree Golf Club on Friday for a rehearsal dinner. It was great. Why were you comfortable at that party? I want to give you a minute first. Just where can you remember when you were at a party where you were just comfortable? Everybody got something? This is not to, you're not to be embarrassed about it. Okay, who was at that party? I knew almost everybody at this party except the husband, the groom's family, who I got to sit with and get to know. And how do you think our conversation started? Right? Where do you live? Where'd you grow up? Where'd you go to school? What's your handicap? What do you mean you like Duke basketball? Right, and within 3 questions, you're into something that's common, something that your past are common. And that's comfortable, and it goes on, and you know some of the same people. Let me tell you, if you're in the Episcopal Church, nobody in the Episcopal Church is more than 2 degrees separated from anybody else in the Episcopal Church. I tell this to priests when we interview them. It's like, be nice to people, because you're going to see them again. But it's fun, right? You have a commonality with those people. There's something to talk about. And you often don't even realize other people that are there who are not comfortable with the conversation, who feel excluded. I had a friend that walked into a group once, and we were all, I think we literally all grew up in the South. I think we probably had all gone to North Carolina. We were just rambling on about what we were doing, and that person was like, what are y'all doing? Thankfully, this person was strong enough and courageous enough to speak up. But we didn't know. We had left her feeling very uncomfortable, but we had no idea. We were just doing what we do. So these things are natural enough, but it's good to know when you're doing it. So if you can think of that party, who was there? Who was there? Doug?
That same experience can happen, not necessarily you knowing the people that are there. We attended a party a couple of weeks ago, didn't know many of the people, but it all turned out that by not knowing them, we had conversations with them and found out that we did know them, as a matter of fact,
Right.
years ago.
Right. That's a point I'm trying to make. Yeah. No, thank you. Yes, it can. Yes, it can. So, that it helpfully gets to the next question, which is, what was it that made you comfortable there? In that moment, maybe what made you comfortable was the discovery that you had something in common, maybe from a different perspective, and that was fun, right? I can't tell you how often I've gone to parties now where somebody says, what do you do? Not cathedral parties. I say, well, I'm a priest. And they're like, right. You know, and that's what Elizabeth Oldfield, if you're reading the book, describes when she goes to that event. Do you remember? She's the religious representative at this kind of London version of Burning Man, and nobody's even talking to her, and she gets so upset. And it's not uncommon. The point I'm getting to is not that you're doing anything wrong or that we are doing anything wrong. It's just self-awareness, right? That we're drawn, I think, to people that are like us because we're using the commonalities that we can identify as proxies for trust and safety and security. You with me? We're using the things we see in common as proxies for trust and safety and security. So naturally we feel better. You know, I was director of Emmaus House for a while, which is down near where Turner Field used to be in Peoplestown, and I first got down there, and it became evident to me right away that my buckhead self had no idea what the rules were. So I couldn't tell who I needed to worry about and who I didn't need to worry about. And I gradually figured it out, or literally asked people to educate me. And then when I did have a sense of who was trouble and who wasn't, it wasn't the people I thought before. I didn't know, right? I only had the way I looked at things. I had to learn another way of looking at things in order even to know how to walk through the world. Not because I'm a bad person or somehow elitist, just because that was my experience. All right. So, flip it. Think of a time when you were uncomfortable at a party. Again, you're welcome to share, but you don't have to. Think of a time when you were uncomfortable. You don't have to, you can just be quiet and your brain's gonna suggest a couple of times to you, right? Yeah. There's a mic right behind you, thank you.
When you go to a gathering of any kind and everybody else there knows each other and they make a little bit of effort to include you in the beginning, and then pretty soon they're all telling stories and you're totally left out. So
right.
That makes me uncomfortable.
Yeah. And if you're like me, you're not only kind of not included, you also just don't know how to read the fact that you're not included. Have you been rejected, or just people are forgotten, or are they going to get around to you eventually? It's just hard to tell sometimes. This gets back to my mother's dinner seating arrangement rule. Have I told you this? My mother, boy, girl, can't sit next to your spouse. There's one party at that table you don't know. I mean, I'd go home for Christmas dinner from college and there'd be some random stranger. Boy, girl, can't sit next to your spouse, somebody at the table you don't know. What happens? Conversation's a lot better. Because that person that you don't know in a civil setting where you're aware of them stops you from doing those things. As much anyway, right? Because you're wanting to be hospitable to them. So you're explicitly including them, and that opens up all kinds of new conversations that you might not have had. So when you were uncomfortable, who was there? They may have been people you didn't like. They may have been people from another place. There may have been people from a different socioeconomic class or a different race. It doesn't really matter. In each instance, they're people not like you, I bet. They're people not like you. Now, I'm not attributing any moral valence to this distinction. So I'm not saying we're bad, that we live in our bubbles. I love my bubble. I'm not leaving my bubble. I have to periodically, and it only reminds me that I'm going back. I love it when people outside the perimeter complain about traffic. I'm like, the point, I think, that I want to make, that I made in my sermon, is just because you start there doesn't mean you have to finish there. It's natural to be drawn to people that are like us. But you don't have to stop there, because fundamentally, our basic faith is that everybody is like us in the most important way, right? Everybody at core has a soul that is God, that is loving. We strive to respect the dignity of every human being. You've heard me say before, strive is maximum, continuous, sustained, persistent effort. Respect is look again, right? The Latin etymology, look again, respect the dignity of every human being. And that is, until you find it, keep looking, right? That's core to who we think we are. We repeat that promise every time we baptize a new member of the community. The point I want to make, and I think Elizabeth Oldfield is making, is just because we have a natural, evolutionarily determined predilection for going to people that are like us doesn't mean we stay there. And as I said in my sermon, there are three good examples. Well, let me just say it differently. We're social animals. So we are drawn to, feel compassionate toward, and want to be with other people. Not only people that look like us, but other people too. And so it's good to be in spaces like this one where you are in with people that aren't like you by design. Our demographic groups are all thrown in. There are socioeconomic groups that are all thrown in. There are racial groups that are all thrown in. And here we are. I'm not saying it's perfect in any of those respects, but how many other institutions in your life are like that? It's as I walk around the world, there are fewer and fewer of them, right? There are fewer, once a month I go to Corso and Peachtree Hills and Lynbrook and Canterbury, where it's all sorted by age. They're nice places, those are nice people, that's not the point, right? Or I go into the preschool and they're all these young kids, but they're all sorted by age too. The parents are doing what the parents do, they're so busy, they don't have time wandering around looking for people like me. Right? But then that's their life. So where do you have the experience of people that don't fit into those age demographics? It's interesting to watch our guilds, our ECW guilds, which used to be very focused on age demographics. You know, these are young mothers, and my sense is that more and more people are looking at common interest or projects. Because I think in some cases, I've heard women say this explicitly, because then we get an intergenerational group together and that's really fun. Now, I'm just saying that's church. But it takes us from being locked into people like us to getting to know people who are not like us. And what happens is that we find out they actually, to Doug's point, they actually are like us. Who knew? So if we're trapped in rhetoric that is divisive, we're going to miss that opportunity. We're going to miss that relationship. So peacemaking then, and Oldfield gives us 4 different ways. Disrupt the tribes, stand your ground, love and blessing, interrupt the cycle. So disrupt the tribes. Anybody know who this is on the picture? Jesus? Yes. Can we get a mic over here? Yeah, oh, Christ. Yes, thank you. This was the cover of Popular Mechanics. Back in the day, they found some skulls that would have been in the same territory Jesus was, the same time he was, and did a forensic thing and came up with this picture. Hadn't seen it on any stained glass windows, but I like it. Just a reminder of the disruption that Jesus brought about. So what did Jesus do? Disrupt the tribes, or what I've been calling people like us and not like us. He's wandering around with women who've been caught in adultery. How about that woman who was hemorrhaging? Lepers. Apparently there was another woman caught in adultery. The woman that dared to touch his naked feet, Roman soldiers, tax collectors, blind men, lame men. You get the impression that Jesus walked in the room and suddenly found the lowest status person there and went right to them, don't you? There's a great story of the Dalai Lama coming to New York and coming up in this grand limousine, and all of the elite folk were there to meet him, and he gets out of the limousine and he notices a porter at the far end, and he goes straight to him to talk to him. upsetting everybody who'd been waiting all this time. I get the impression Jesus did that repeatedly. So it's interesting then to use as just a way of being, to go through life noticing people that other people aren't talking to. And you find that they're actually have stories that are very interesting. This is not surprising to you, I know. But we're all busy, we're all running through life. Sometimes you just have to do that, Lance.
I guess sometimes a story in the opposite. So I went to a Stacey Abrams rally, and it was in.
Was Doug there?
What's that?
Is that where? That one? Oh. Sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I went to a Stacey Abrams rally, and it was in I guess somewhere in Midtown. I do not know Atlanta that well, and it was in an old basketball. Well, actually, they were going to knock the school down, so it was in the old gym. And so I walk in, and I mean, I'm not dressed any particular way or whatever, and so I'm kind of tall, and I didn't want to block anybody's view or anything, and I wanted a good view, so I went and stood. All the cameras were sort of at half court, and then where she was going to speak was sort of under the basketball goal. And so I'm just standing there, and this guy comes up to me and he looks at me, and he's plastered with, Stacey Abrams and member staff and all this kind of stuff. And he looks at me and goes, "Are you from Fox News?" And I said, "No." He goes, "Well, somebody told me, or we heard that there was going to be a producer from Fox News here, and we all gathered around, about 10 of us over there, and we decided it was you." And I said, "Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for my, whatever."
I would have said, could I get an interview with Stacey? Yeah. Well,
Her father was the sweetest, nicest, calmest guy. I go fishing where he lives, nearby in Southwest, in Southeast Mississippi, where she's from. And she should have run with him or had him on all the ads, because he was fantastic.
Right, good, thank you. So one thing is disrupt the tribes. This is just an effort to be conscious of pushing back on the people like me syndrome, right? I'm trying to stop short of saying that's some kind of evil thing that we have to defend ourselves against. I'm just saying it's a natural tendency, but there are ways to stop it and at least not let it get out of hand. The second is stand your ground. This is a portrait of Rosa Parks on the bus, just because that face seems so committed. Maintain eye contact or keep the conversation open, not as a cowering victim, but as somebody committed to connection. I've cast this in civil rights to give it some oomph, but it doesn't have to be in such a crisis. It could be in any conversation. We've talked before about nurturing heart as a parenting method, for example. And the third part of nurturing heart is be absolutely clear. Or maybe you've heard clear as kind, right? Being able to stand your ground, still yourself, not get triggered, and speak with some equanimity is of great value when everybody else is triggered. But it often takes practice, I think. But the civil rights movement is a great example of that, because, of course, this didn't just happen. They trained for that, right? They didn't just march out into the street. They trained for how to be when hoses were turned on them or dogs were let loose on them or batons were wielded on them. William Willimon, do you guys know William Willimon? He's a famous Methodist bishop. And he went down to one of the, might have been Birmingham, I can't remember, one of the marches, and he's a white guy, and he just got frustrated with all his prep. He's like, "Come on, let's get on the street. What are we doing?" And the guy who was training him said, "Son, when they unleash those dogs and they turn that fire hose on you, you need to know who you are and whose you are. You need to know who you are and whose you are," which I think is really powerful in a smaller way. It's the same with us, right? That comes through your prayer life. through your other practices. It's hard to summon it up in the moment if you hadn't worked on it, right? Just like anything else. Part of what we're doing here is training ourselves to be present, to be grounded, even when the world wants to take us in another direction. The next would be love and blessing, and this is James Baldwin, who's just a brilliant writer, and he wrote a piece called Letter to My Nephew, which kind of precedes Ta-Nehisi Coates' work. And in it, he says this to his nephew: "You must accept them with love, for these innocent people have no other hope." Who do you think he's talking about? He's talking about white folk. That's who he's talking about. So and he's a gay man, he's gay and black, and what he's saying in the midst of all of that is these folks are caught up in their own system, which is torturing them, and they're so caught up in it they don't even know it. So you need to figure out how to accept them too. That's what love and blessing means. And finally, interrupt the cycle. There's a wonderful story in the book, and it's actually worth reading the book just to read the story, where Elizabeth Oldfield, who lives in a community in a part of London that's transitioning a little bit, the community that's been there is Afro-Caribbean, typically, and she gets on the bus with her son, or child anyway, and she gives her child a seat, and the bus comes along, and this woman gets on the bus. She tells you the story before telling you it's an Afro-Caribbean woman, but that's who it is. And she gets on the bus and the woman says, "Move that child." And Elizabeth says, there are seats all over this bus. She says, "I want that seat, move that child." And Elizabeth gets triggered, right? And so she does, in fact, move the child, and then she mutters something less than kind to the woman, and the woman then continues to mutter for the next 3 stops, something less than kind about Elizabeth, and there they are, knees touching, muttering about each other. Sounds awful. And Elizabeth said, for reasons she can't explain, something came over her, and she looked at the woman and she said, "Can we start again? Can we start again?" And the woman said, "Sure." And they did. And their conversation quickly blossomed into what they had in common, the struggles this woman had had in the neighborhood, what it meant to have white people coming into her neighborhood, and what that was doing to all of the structures, the matriarchal structures, which had existed there. And they've remained friends ever since. So the final practice is interrupt the cycle. I've done this. It's a useful practice. I will tell you, it's harder than you might think. Because you can't say, "Can we start again?" without letting go of some of the "right after I kill you" feelings. It's not, "I'm going to kill you, resurrect you, and then we can go." It's like, no, how do I let go of the injustice I think you've perpetuated, of the harm I think you've inflicted? How do I let go all of that? I'm forgiving you, basically, right? Without your having admitted to anything or promised any repentance. And then can we start again? It's a powerful, powerful move, and I think it works a whole lot more than you might think. At the base of all this, though, this is Cole Arthur Riley, who's written a couple of books that I think I really love. One of them is Black Liturgies, and one of them is, anybody read this? Is it That There Flesh or something like that? Anyway, she's a brilliant writer. She also suffers from chronic diseases. I think her own experience of her own suffering is part of the reason she's so brilliant and wise. But what she says in underlying all these practices is practice unapologetic particularity. Unapologetic particularity, by which she means pay attention to the person in front of you, to them, to the particulars of them. Not the context they're in, not the preconditions you have, not anything you think they might be representing, but to them. Which is kind of like active listening, but with more oomph, right? And I think as we close, that if you don't remember anything else, just remember that. There's a lot of God to be discovered by paying attention to the person in front of you, no matter what. No matter what. And you will find that the people like you, which creates a group of people not like you, the more we engage in these practices, the more that not like you group just goes away, right? Which is just what Doug was saying, I think. I'll pay you later for that comment, right? It's like, that's the whole point, right? Of being a way that puts us into a relationship with other people, so we are changed by that engagement, and so are they. But there's a lot of stuff to overcome sometimes. And I think the bottom line for me is it's worth it. It's worth it. And you know what else? Our children need for us to do that. Remember the Jane Goodall quote that I offered you last time? We think we've inherited the earth from our ancestors, but really we borrowed it from our children. We think we've inherited the earth from our ancestors, but really we borrowed it from our children. If you can find no other reason to engage in these practices, your children, our children, are a good one. All right. I've left you 35 seconds for questions. Do you have any? All right. Again, thank you for coming. What I'm trying to say is that the language we often use of bubbles and people like us often tends to be leveled at us as if we, all of us, are morally failing by virtue of being in this position. And I want to reframe that, not as a moral failure, but as an evolutionarily determined way of being. We're there for good reasons, but we don't have to stay there. We're social animals. We are naturally attracted to other people. That's the weakness of the people like me syndrome. That's the weakness of the syndrome. And so if we find practices and other ways to engage in other people, then division doesn't have to be our destiny. Division doesn't have to be our destiny. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.